Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the GFE Annual Conference, and welcome to my family room. I chose this location because when we're together, it really feels like I'm with family. Over the past couple of years before the conference started, I got to run from one table to the next, saying hello to old friends and making new ones. I really miss that. I really miss all of you and hope we're in person together soon. It's a privilege to be kicking off our virtual conference on Indigenous Peoples Day. Let us start together by acknowledging the fact that wherever you are right now, you are on land that was stolen from Indigenous people. I'm in Boston, on land taken from the Wampanoag and Massachusetts tribes. As a community about to engage in a weeks-long conversation about keeping our promises to the next generation, it is our duty to honor Native American voices and create a space where Native American contributions are included, uplifted, and celebrated. It is also our hope that as a community of education funders, we not only think and reflect more on the painful history and current struggles of Native American communities, but also take action to help repair and heal the harms of these communities. If you are not familiar with it already, please take a moment to look up the Native American history of the land where you live. I'd like to make two additional acknowledgements. First is to our sponsors. Most of you know that the annual conference is our biggest thing we do at GFE. Without conference sponsorship, we'd be nowhere as an organization. Our sponsors really stepped up this year. They allowed us to get this really fancy technology for the conference. I'm really hoping it goes well. I'm really nervous. And I'm hooked up to an Ethernet cable for the first time in this millennia to make sure that if there is a problem, it's not on my end. I also want to say thank you to our planning committee, 16 members of the GFE community who did some heavy lifting in uncharted waters this year. So the RFP for session proposals closed in mid-March, and we all know what mid-March was. So it takes a lot of time to read and score these. So we turned to the conference planning committee and asked, are you really willing to do this, not knowing what's going to happen with it? And they all said yes. This is really important that we have the highest quality sessions, and it's really important that we find a way to present them. So I'm really grateful to them because I think we've got a really great slate. So now I want to shift to the layout of the conference. As many of you already know, the breakout sessions happen during conference year-round. So those are happening every month. At the beginning of the month, we run 8 sessions over the first week of the month. So that was all intended to limit your time in front of the screen this week. We all know that Zoom and screen fatigue is real, and so we're trying to kind of build around that. We're asking for 3 hours of your time for our core program, every day from 12:30 to 2 Eastern, and then again from 3:30 to 5. 12:30 to 2 is going to be our time for plenaries, and 3:30 to 5 are our deep dives. This is the time when you can do case studies, virtual site visits, workshops. This week we have a great session with Promise 54 about living our DEI values. So that's it, 3 hours. And then we have a number of fun networking opportunities and kind of unusual things that we're trying to do online for the first time. So you can sign up for brain dates to connect with peers and talk about certain topics. You can join our Slack channels so that you can chat in real time during the plenaries. We know many of you are home with kids, so we have a family book club, and you're welcome to bring your kids to it. It's intended to build cultural competence. After this session, you're going to find me in our mindfulness and movement space, and that's run by the Black Yoga Teachers Alliance. And we have the Creative Sprint again this year. We have a video about that at the end. So we decided we need 5 days of the week to do justice to all of the challenging issues that affect our work. So here's the layout of the next few days. We're really orienting toward creating a vision for the next stage of our work together, thinking beyond the crisis to where do we go from here. So today we're talking about the future of democracy and student voice. Tomorrow is the future of pre-K through 12 education. Wednesday is our big picture day, the future of philanthropy and an inequitable society. And I've got to let you know that that's the day we're releasing the results of our survey, which I found surprising and confirmatory, really, really interesting results. Day 4 is the future of post-secondary education, and day 5 is the future of racial justice. And stay tuned for that one, because we're going to be announcing a brand new GFE program focused on racial justice. Before we start the program, I'd also like to say a word about purpose. When I picked this theme almost a year ago now, I had no idea the meaning it would take on today. Keeping our promises to the next generation, education and democracy. Of course, I knew we'd be on the brink of an election, but I could not have guessed that the president would be actively undermining our democracy and the voting process. Of course, I knew we were living in an era when threats to Black and Brown citizens were growing, but I could not have guessed the power of the movement that includes so many young people to demand safety, opportunity, justice, and an end to racism in America. Of course, I knew that education was and will continue to be a key to keeping our promises to the next generation, but I could not have guessed students would spend most of this year out of school, in too many instances, lacking basic needs, lacking safety, in all cases, losing the opportunity to learn and falling behind their international peers. I'm not giving away a secret when I tell you that our survey revealed that everything feels more urgent now in philanthropy. The need is greater than ever, which is why we come together here and why we've been so intentional about this program. We need each other. We need to step back. We need to think big, and we need to figure out how to act together. To ensure we centered on our theme and we centered on students' experiences, we asked Generation Citizen and the PBS Student Reporting Lab to ask young people to record themselves answering this question. What do you want the people leading our country today to know about the America you would like to inherit as an adult? Here's what they had to say.
To make voting practices much more simplified and straightforward. We need to work towards getting rid of all of these hurdles that often prevent people from voting, such as not making Election Day a federal holiday, having these really restrictive voter ID laws, and also ending the practice of gerrymandering. We also need to work towards creating a less intimidating and more welcoming voting system.
I care deeply about socioeconomic inequality. So many people lack access to basic necessities and economic opportunity, and the pandemic has only worsened this. Our leaders should be fighting for those who need it most.
One thing that I hope changes in democracy before I'm a real adult is to get corporate money out of politics. I feel like politicians should be elected by the people and not by corporations.
Is that voting rights violations are stopped before they happen. Too often, certain states enact illegal voting restrictions that take years to be taken down. Everyone deserves equal access to participate in our democracy.
If students could vote in municipal elections starting at age 16 instead of 18, we'd foster a lot more civic engagement among young people, and our democracy would be a lot stronger for it.
If there's one thing about our democracy that I hope changes, is the prevailing lack of civic knowledge and political awareness. If we want to make sure that people are voting, engaging in local and federal politics, and having a voice in their communities long term, there needs to be a foundational understanding of exactly how to do that. Whether it's a mandated civic curriculum across all schools or building partnerships with nonprofits and government agencies, in order to have a fulfilling democracy, civic education and engagement really does need to be at the forefront.
Being represented by people with similar backgrounds is very important when the government makes decisions that affect us. Plus, diverse representation will enable all voices to be heard and make us feel like we matter.
I believe that our differences should be celebrated instead of being a reason why one person gets more opportunities and even more rights than another person. and I believe that our leaders should be working towards initiating change on a leadership level so we can start moving in the right direction as a society.
I hope that sometime in the near future, our government will stop confusing us and dividing us based on our political stances. I hope that the candidates for government will stop pinpointing each other's flaws and instead focus on fixing their own. I hope they can support each other and work together regardless of who wins in the election.
Is the presence of youth within our system. And this is because youth are the ones that are most vulnerable to change. They are also the ones who I feel are at the forefront of many of our politics that are going on right now, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, they're the ones that are spreading the message. They're the ones that are educating themselves and each other. And they're the ones on the front lines at most of our protests. So I feel that in the future, I would love to see them have more presence in our democracy and not be looked over.
I don't think that our democracy is truly a democracy because it doesn't represent all people and it doesn't represent all citizens in the United States. So I think that until our legislation is actually aimed at benefiting all people, not just cis white men, we aren't actually in a democracy. And I hope that does change by the time I am an adult.
Is the division between both political parties so that they can communicate effectively to reach common goals, as well as unify the country to live and respect one another based off of our character and not political party.
Definitely lowering the voting age to 16. A lot of young people are getting involved in those important political discussions where they are arming themselves with the political knowledge they need to know about the candidates to be involved in their local governments. And I just think creating those habitual habits of voting at an early age is very important to continue that into adulthood.
Well, I hope to see America lower the voting age to 16. If 16-year-olds are paying taxes and able to drive, they should also have the right to vote. In fact, according to a study at the University of Kentucky, lowering the voting age can create a habit of voting and increase the overall turnout in later years. Also, it can also have a trickle-up effect. What I mean by that is that when young people vote, their parents are more likely to vote too. As a result, young people can inspire the elders to take part and have their voice heard in the community.
That the youth of not only today, but in the future coming generations as well, know and understand the importance of civic engagement in their community and just the fact that they can make a change no matter how little or big it is, that their voice matters in this community.
I think that the voting process should be a lot faster or shouldn't take more than 30 minutes to vote. The lines were so long that they were like cutting around streets. They were cutting to streets, cutting around sidewalks, going around corner stores. And there were like people asking, where are you voting? Where are you waiting for? Like, oh, we're trying to vote. And this long line, it's like insane. It's like you want to go to Black Friday. Like, no, no one should wait more than 30 minutes to vote. And that's what I hope to change.
I see social injustice every day. And it has been affecting my ancestors for so long. And those problems aren't just old problems. Racism, slavery, segregation, those aren't just old problems. They've transformed into modern day issues. And so we're still fighting that today. So that is an issue that just runs deep in my heart, that it just needs to come to a stop. As a leader, you should fight for what is right.
Voter suppression is an issue that plagues America. It truly contradicts our American values. So by the time that I'm an adult, I hope that everyone is able to vote. And they don't have to wait in ridiculous 3-hour lines. This process needs to be enhanced. And I hope that together, and by the time that I'm an adult, things will be better and everyone's voices will matter.
The Electoral College was made as an approach to keep the general population from voting or choosing an entirely unsatisfactory individual that might be unfit for the highest office, that there was a last concluding body to prevent mob rule. Now, however, it has simply become one more divisive partisan fighting, and that benefits the party with the least standard and minimal duty to democracy. And I conclude that this is one thing that our democracy that I hope would see change once I become an adult.
And there's a quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and it says the time is always right to do the right thing. To me, a leader is able to identify when it's time to do the right thing, whether that's changing your environment, changing your community, or time to stand up for something that you believe in. As a leader, you understand the right time and when change is necessary.
This is our world. This is our city. This is our country. This is our home. So I'm. This is our world. This is our city. This is our country. This is our home. So I'm gonna vote. And if you're with me, we get to change the way of how the story's told. And I'll see how the new beginning unfolds. Go out and vote. It's been really hard to believe that we can overcome the struggle. Hard times haven't been subtle. All my peers and friends and family can see we're running out of time. This moment's got to shine. Oh, time to make a change now. Everybody upstanding. Gotta build toward the justice everybody's demanding. Our future is all in our control. Can't let this future go. This is our world.
That was fantastic. Great way to start. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers, who are going to offer 4 short talks, and then we'll transition to an interactive panel. First up is going to be Nikki Pitre, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Native American Youth. Next will be David Banks, who's the President and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation and the founder of the Eagle Academy School for Young Men. Sarah Audelo, Executive Director of the Alliance for Youth Action. And then finally, Andrew Wilkes, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at Generation Citizen. Take it away, Nikki. Thank you.
Hello, my relatives. My name is Nikki Pitre. My Indian name is Meadowlark. In our ways, meadowlarks bring good medicine, and I hope to bring that to you today. I'm a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, with Spokane, Yakima, Nisqually, Kalispell, Squaxin Island, and Taino heritage. I'm a direct descendant of Chief Ignis, Chief Spokane, Chief Leshai, and Chief Kamiakin. I'm a proud product of intergenerational resiliency and excellence. I serve as the first Native American woman to be an executive director at the Aspen Institute. My program is called the Center for Native American Youth. I am joining you virtually from the traditional territories of the Salish, Snohomish, and Tulalip people. 2020 has been a historic year for Indigenous people and our movement, from combating racist Native sports mascots to ensuring tribal sovereignty is upheld in protecting the land against oil pipelines, from United States Supreme Court ruling McGirt versus Oklahoma to a historic number of Indigenous people running for political office. We are truly changing the world that we wish to see, and it is young people who have been at the forefront of this movement. As 2020 is ending, Native youth continue to combat a pandemic that has disproportionately affected our people, and youth are using their voices as we demand racial justice. Science and data tells us that Native people are easily forgotten when we are left out of data or included as other, overlooked because our populations are perceived as too small to make a difference in society, the election, or political outcomes. But as I mentioned, it is young people who are building a movement that we will reflect, honor, and lift when these moments are recorded in our history books. In 2018, we celebrated the first Native American women elected to Congress, showing that Natives are essential to shaping and creating a representative democracy. As many other communities, the right to vote was a hard-fought and recent victory for Native people. We were not granted citizenship by the federal government until 1924. In fact, Utah became the last state to allow Native people to vote in 1962. As we face the election of a lifetime, it is imperative that youth, especially Native youth, are present in conversations about the future of this country. The Native vote will help determine the outcome of 77 presidential electoral votes, in addition to critical state, House, Senate, and other races. For many, it will be their first time voting, and for others who are under the age of 18, they'll be urging their family members to vote on issues that impact them. In partnership with Illuminative, the Native Organizers Alliance, and the University of Michigan, the Center for Native American Youth surveyed over 1,000 Native youth on democracy, the impacts of COVID-19, current trust in systems, as well as their hopes for the future. This survey was called the Indigenous Future Survey. I'd like to take a moment to share with you some of the findings about Native youth. Native youth wish to undo negative effects of policies sought to destroy their communities and revitalize their culture. Native youth report lower rates of voting in their age group to barriers, including access to polling places. To address this, we need to ensure access to polling places for young people. The Indigenous Future Survey told us that 1 in 5 voice matters. When it comes to inspiring the youth vote, it is imperative that politicians are not only listening to the priorities of Native youth, but also working to address these priorities, thereby affirming the importance of their voice and voting. Top 4 priorities Native youth have identified are mental health, addressing violence against Native women and girls, preserving their tribal language, and caring for elders. Despite the low rates of voting, Native youth engage in the political system. In fact, 88% have signed a petition, 88% have shared political content on their social media platforms, nearly half have participated in community action groups or grassroots organizing, and attended protests to ensure their voices are heard and that they are contributing to positive futures of their communities. Youth are the future, and it is imperative that we empower them to use their collective voices for the betterment of their families and their communities. I encourage everyone to empower, support, love, and holistic support when engaging Native American youth. We run initiatives at the Center for Native American Youth that give agency to young leaders, and particularly the Democracy is Indigenous campaign. In Democracy is Indigenous, we are working with over 100 Native youth from throughout the country in distributing almost $200,000 directly into the hands of Native youth to ensure that their communities are civically engaged. Whether it's making sure they're accounted for in the census, community members are registered to vote, and ultimately everyone does their part as we are all working tirelessly leading up to this historic election. In closing, I want to share with you the words of a young leader from the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. Trenton states, "I used to think that not voting was an act of rebellion. Now I understand that not voting is an act of surrender." We are proud to uplift youth like Trenton to ensure that Native American youth are contributing to our society. Liam Lynch, Inchas Ba'us, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is David Banks. I'm the president and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation. And in that role and capacity, I oversee a network of all boys public schools in the New York City area. We have one in every borough in New York, and we have one in Newark, New Jersey. So as I sit here today, we have over 3,000 boys from grade 6 through grade 12 who are in our classrooms, and we've graduated now over 2,000 young men and sent them off to colleges and universities all across the nation. But before that, I was the founding principal of the original Eagle Academy in the Bronx. And prior to that, I was the principal of another high school also in the Bronx that I founded as well, called the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice. So I've been a teacher, I've been an assistant principal, I've been a principal over the course of 13 years. And in addition to the work that I do now at the Eagle Foundation, where we provide a level of support to the young men that we work with. But as I reflect on this opening and the future of student voice and our democracy, I am deeply concerned while also being very excited all at the same time. I'm concerned because I recognize that the United States has the lowest rate of youth voter turnout in the world. And right here in New York State, we rank 41st in the nation in youth voter turnout. In fact, only 58% of eligible Americans even voted in the 2016 presidential election. And so we wonder, and we talk quite a bit about the apathy of the American citizen and why they're not as involved as they need to be. And it is certainly my contention that all of that starts with the lack of voter or the lack of civic engagement in the K through 12 experience. Imagine this, from the time that a child comes into our public school system in the kindergarten and stays all the way through the 12th grade, the overwhelming majority of those 12th graders who graduate can't really tell you what a congressperson really does. They don't know the difference between a state assemblyman or a state senator. They rarely know what a city council person is fully engages in and what their job responsibilities are. They are not clear about how government actually operates and how the levers of power are engaged. And that's not their fault. That's because we haven't taught all of our young people how to be engaged. And there you see a picture of some young people from a high school in Chicago who are fully engaged, out protesting about clean energy. These are young people who have obviously been studying this issue and are out letting their voices be heard. And this is the kind of thing that you have to have for young people. All too often, when our students go to school, our children go to school, and they come back and we ask them, how was school today? And they say, fine. Because very often they're engaged in things that are boring. They're not connected to anything that they really want to talk about. And they're certainly not connected to the issues of the day. But this is a clear example of young people who are woke, who are paying attention to the issues, who are learning about clean and renewable energy in their science classes, probably writing to state legislators in their English classes. But ultimately also beyond their classes, what's really important when you're working with young people learn best by doing. They've got to get out there and they've got to be on the front lines and they've got to actually go out and do something. And so these are young people who will never forget the lessons about clean energy because they're fully engaged. And that reminds me of a time when I was my first couple of years as a principal in the Bronx, and I was the principal of a co-ed school. And one day I went into a classroom and one of my girls was in the room and she said, Mr. Banks, all the other students were in the lunchroom. And she said, I'm getting ready to go to lunch, but I'm really upset because she looked out the window and she saw this huge cigarette advertisement that was overlooking our school. And she said, it doesn't seem right to me that cigarette advertisement would be so close to our building. And we should do something about that. And that led us to stop everything we were doing in our school. And for the next 2 weeks, we studied in our science classes the harmful effects of nicotine on the body and why cigarette smoking was not good for you. We found out in our law classes that the city council had actually proposed legislation that they sent to the mayor for him to sign, banning the use of cigarette advertisements within 5,000 feet of schools. So in our math classes, they went outside and they were measuring cars to determine the average car length. And then they did estimation to see how many cars it would take between the front of our building and the building which housed that cigarette advertisement, to see if it fell, in fact, within the legislation, the proposed legislation. And in their English classes, the students were writing letters to the mayor, urging the mayor to sign that legislation to remove the use of cigarette advertisements so close to schools. And we packaged all of that together. I had never seen my students in all my years in education so excited because they were fully engaged on a problem. It was a social problem, something that they could really wrap their hearts and minds around and feel like they could do something. And they did. And we sent all those letters into City Hall. And then we got a call a week later. And the mayor's office said they'd never seen anything like that, an entire school project. And they wanted us to know that the mayor was going to sign that bill and make it a law. And they wanted me to bring a number of my students with me down to City Hall in New York City for the bill signing. And if you go to the next slide, and there you see an old black and white photo in New York City And Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York at the time. And my students, as they surrounded him as he signed that bill into law. And can you just imagine how exciting that was for those young people to see that they actually made a difference? And that 30 days later, the city workers came out and removed that cigarette advertisement. That is what education should be about. That's what civic engagement is all about. And that is what I see when I think about the future of student voice in our democracy. We've got to shift from having young people just in class going through the motions and really get them engaged in powerful real life examples of things that they can make a difference. And so I just want to thank you and looking forward to this conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be with you. My name is Andrew Wilkes. Serve a generation citizen as the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy. And in that capacity, I have the great joy of working with our executive directors in 6 regions across the country, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, as well as Oklahoma, Texas, and California, to make sure that every student can learn civics by doing civics. One of my fellow colleagues on the panel just spoke about the importance of K through 12 civics education, and I just want to build on those remarks because in many respects, that's the heart and soul of what Generation Citizen does. And we've been incredibly inspired by seeing what students do when they have access to a hands-on civics education, which speaks to their lived experiences and gives them the space to identify issues that they care about. What we've seen after teaching over 75,000 young folks, what we call action civics across the country, is that young people are already catalysts for civic renewal. And so we could say that young people are creating the future of our democracy right now through their research, through root cause analysis on issues that they care about, and investigating how our democratic institutions work, and through taking appropriate collective action to address those issues. We've seen young people serve as poll workers, as protesters, as advocates for lowering the voting age, as well as the other measures of civic participation, such as joining organizations, service learning, and getting involved in the public policy process. In the past year, Generation Citizen has worked alongside local organizations across the country as a part of an equity in civics field building initiative. And we worked in 7 regions of the country to hold what we called listening tour events, comprised of students, parents, educators, and district leaders. And the goal of each conversation is how can we catalyze and further undergird a will to place racial equity in particular, but not exclusively, at the center of what it means to do democracy education. Through that experience, I've been inspired to hear about young people rolling up their sleeves for civic participation, doing things like petitioning local school boards for COVID-19 relief funding, speaking up for a truly pertinent democracy education that, again, not only speaks to their lives, but helps to demystify how our political process works. And we've also seen in this kind of action civics process that both teachers and students report from a pre and post survey evaluation method, that students complete that process with an increased amount of civic knowledge, that they have a developed and heightened sense of their civic skills, and that they've also cultivated a sense of civic agency and investment in our democracy. And so in terms of this critical question that's convened us all today, student voice in our democracy, my response succinctly would be that in the future, as in the present, young people are serving as committed and constructive catalysts for civic and democratic renewal.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonia Matthew, and I'm a program officer in the Democracy program at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation in Chicago, Illinois. And I'm honored to be in the company of such incredible leaders who are so passionate and committed to strengthening student voice in our democracy. A colleague recently reminded me of this John Dewey quote where he stated, "Democracy is born anew every generation, and education is its midwife." And as demonstrated by our colleagues earlier in this panel, we are in a moment where young people are truly leading the way and have the potential to shape what our democracy looks like. With education being the midwife, schools are one of the first democratic institutions that young people are exposed to. And it's really important to think about the opportunities and experiences that students have in schools to ensure that our youth are informed, actively participate in their communities, and are developing healthy civic dispositions, which is the ultimate goal of my work. And our work in Illinois strengthens the civic learning experiences in schools, but also the organizational culture in schools so that civic learning can be sustained. And one element of organizational culture that we support is student voice in schools. And we believe that schools should be providing formal, informal, and regular opportunities for student voice and student decision-making that is impactful at various levels of the school community. And this ends up being the responsibility of both school administrators and of classroom teachers. And you see this work being implemented by integrating student voice into curriculum, assessments, and classroom practices, but also by ensuring that there are some school-wide mechanisms to solicit feedback from students and also respond to issues that impact the student body. And my colleague David just spoke about how his school was really able to do this and do it well. Ultimately, adults can and should be working in partnership with their students to support young people to develop the civic dispositions that we need our students to carry with them to ensure that our democracy is carried forward and rebirthed in the best possible way.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone, and thank you for your patience with some of our technical glitches. As I said earlier, my name is Gwen Hughes. I'm from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. For many years, we have focused on after school and community schools as a key strategy to support youth. It's wonderful to be here with so many leaders in this space, and I want to thank our speakers, my co-facilitator and GFE for prioritizing this issue, which is so critical. Partly what I want to just talk about for a few minutes is how we as funders have supported youth voice and give us some ideas to think about in the future, and how some of our work that the foundation, the Mott Foundation, is invested in really supports lifting up youth voice as part of a key solution to more equitable opportunities in the future. One of the things that we have really focused on is building and supporting an after-school ecosystem. And we find that in this out-of-school time space, as David mentioned earlier, we see a lot of youth engagement and a lot of youth-led activities. Part of our strategy is to support after-school networks in all 50 states. When COVID hit, when we started to really see such huge needs across our communities. And for many folks, really the curtain pulled back on racial injustice that perhaps many folks were not aware of before. We really saw a new level, I think, of youth engagement and voice. Part of the strategy that we saw in the after-school space and out-of-school time space was youth-led convenings, youth town halls, really these kinds of events that were made to identify and support solutions that youth are coming up with themselves. And we find in this space that for much of the programming that we've supported over the years, we think there are about 10 million kids right now, to our best estimates, for youth through K-12 in after-school programs. Many of these are actually older youth serving organizations, and I don't know if we talk about that enough. We just don't call it after school, but we call it different things like career exploration, youth engagement, other key pieces that are really made to engage as many middle and high school kids as possible. So we see, I think, real potential in this space and in bridging school and community for the future. So I want to thank all of you. I'm excited to get to our discussion, and we'll turn it back to my co-facilitator, Sonia.
Yes, thank you, Gwen. And yes, we're definitely looking forward to really digging into some thoughts and reflections from the panel. And so our first question for the panel is just to share some of the reflections on the student video. What stood out for you, and what would you want to amplify from what we heard directly from the young people? And let's start out with Nikki first.
Sure. Thank you so much. I was really inspired by watching those videos. And I think that some common themes that I had written out is the need to remove barriers for young people, create culturally competent curriculum that will help young people better understand the civic engagement process. Also, something that I know our young people are really passionate about, myself too, is very personal, is the importance in representation, political representation that's reflective of all of us. And those are some kind of initial things that I saw across, just again, very inspired about how passionate young people are. And that passion comes from a place of caring. And so, just really, really inspired in this moment.
Thank you, Nikki. David, what were your thoughts?
Great video. I enjoyed it and inspired by it. I'm always inspired to see young people who are so fully engaged and thoughtful about how they would like to see the world, and how they'd like to see other young people show up, and how we need to change and remove those kind of systematic barriers that are in the way. One of the young persons, Hannah Bigby, really emphasized, as did several others, about letting 16-year-olds vote. And I thought that was great. Ishrat Jahan talked about having a civic curriculum and full engagement. And I think in making that point, he was offering up something that I very much believe in, which is a civic curriculum is really important. Civic engagement is probably more important. Teaching the lessons of how government actually works is one thing, but allowing young people to come out of the four walls of the school and to actually get engaged in what's going on in their community, that connection is what creates the aha moments for young people, where they really get it. And because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get to young people who get it, who then become the kind of the lifelong civic engagement folks. Every school in America says we're trying to help to develop our students to be lifelong learners and engage civically. And the vast majority of schools in our country do not practice that at all. And so to hear these young people, Arnab Sikdar, he pointed out that not only the 16-year-olds to be able to vote, but if you do that, the impact that has on their parents as well, and getting them even more engaged. Can you imagine if young people are coming home and when the parents, instead of waiting for them to say, how was school today? They say, hey, Mom, Dad, what kind of healthcare policy do you have? Because we're studying healthcare issues in school. Before you have to ask them about their day, they're talking to you about climate change and why it's so important for us to be paying attention and how to recycle and those kinds of things, because that's what they're actually studying in school. They're not doing nearly enough of that. And I think finally, Kobe Marson with the song at the very end. Just very powerful in that it's a different medium, right? You have to appeal to young people in a host of different ways. You can't just lecture them. They've got to be able to move. They've got to be stimulated through song, through rap, through poetry, spoken word. There are all kinds of ways in which you have to engage them. But the final part that I would also offer up with this, and it wasn't anything that any of the young people said, which is this. Even the schools who engage in getting young people, like we saw those young people in the videotape, are generally doing it for a handful of young people. And they'll say, we have a program and we're engaged and we've got, whatever the program is, a group that came from outside that's helping us. But they're very rarely engaging most of the students. And I would tell you that most students have no idea what's going on. And they become the citizenry that we complain about that's completely apathetic. How do you get to those students, even beyond the ones that we saw in the video, to inspire and lift up those students who otherwise are completely disengaged, have no idea what's going on, and then they become the next generation that's out there, and we continue to complain about the fact that only 58% of people participate in presidential elections because we have not done this at a critical mass level to really make sure everybody is fully engaged. That requires transforming how we do school in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. And, I feel like this might, that theme right there, really transforming what this might look like, hopefully can also really be expanded upon in this next question, which is, why do you do the work that you do and what is at stake? And would love to have Andrew start out and share your thoughts.
Absolutely. My personal kind of why in this work and what's at stake, I often come to some of the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he talks about now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. And the simple truth is that we can't wait another generation to figure out how to make a multiracial democracy a reality. We can't wait another generation to figure out how to take e pluribus unum seriously and not simply articulate that ideal. So what that means in an education and democratic context is that America really has to commit to unlearning racism for us to learn what it means to practice being a democracy in the classroom and in our communities. So what's at stake is preparing young people as well as teachers, district leaders, state superintendents, everybody, right, to recover an urgent sense of the civic mission of schools. And a part of what that looks like is, further investing in teachers' professional development. It looks like centering racial equity in civics and government, not just during emergency times of when someone who has been a victim of disproportionate or deadly police force is trending in our timelines. It has to be a perpetual priority. And that kind of all hands on deck urgency where all stakeholders involved, particularly those who are most impacted, are helping to lead the civic learning process. I think that helps us to take our democracy, which appears itself to be at stake and hanging in the balance, to be something that's made real for our students and community members.
Thank you, Andrew. Sarah, what are your thoughts on, what can you share a little bit about why you do the work that you do and what is at stake?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and sorry for the technical difficulties. Gotta love being remote. Why I do what I do. So I run a network called the Alliance for Youth Action and the Alliance for Youth Organizing. And we're a network of young people, political power building organizations from across the country. In times like this, our groups are running large scale voter registration drives, a lot of work to educate young people about how to vote, and of course, working to turn them out. But the reason why our work is so powerful is because the work is year round. Right after the election, we'll be right back out there alongside young people fighting on the issues that young people care about in city council rooms and school board rooms, at the state legislature and on the federal level. And so when I think about why we do this work, there is no democracy without the youngest members actively participating in it and shaping the future and present of our country. There's no democracy without young people. Young people have led, they've been at the forefront of the largest movements in our country's history. And we see this now with Generation Z and some of the younger millennials, that generation I identify with, also continuing to lead the way. But this work is so incredibly personal because this is a democracy that was not built for us. This is a democracy that was built for white landowning men. And so when we work alongside young people who are very eager to call out the shortcomings of our democracy and put the work in to make change, that's why we do the work. I'm originally from Bakersfield, California, in the Central Valley of California. And I had to leave home to learn how to organize and make change. We had the lovely ladies of the League of Women Voters, these lovely old white ladies, registering voters in our library back home. And they were great, but they weren't my people. And I hate that I had to leave home to be able to make change. But the exciting news is that young people are like, no, we're not going to leave home to make change. We're going to stay home and make change. And that is work that I get to support in my role at the Alliance. And I think we see why that's so important from that video. It makes me think about the young people in our network who passed the first automatic voter registration bill in the country in Oregon. It makes me think about the young people who last year in Colorado passed a piece of legislation that would allow 17-year-olds to vote in a primary if they were 18-year-old by the general election. And you know what? New Era Colorado helped push that forward. Then they targeted all those 17-year-olds to say, hey, you can register to vote now. You can vote in this primary because you'll be 18. And you know what? Those 17-year-olds voted on par with older voters. So it just reminds me, like, so much is at stake. Always. Yes, our democracy is hanging in the balance, to say the least, right now. But young people have been at the forefront of leading that change. We have so many examples of the work that they've led. I'm really grateful for groups like Generation Citizen. The young people they've been working with are incredible, as you can see from that video. And that, to me, is a daily reminder of why we do what we do, is because young people are clear-eyed about what is right and what is wrong in this country, and it's up to us to give them support that they need to lead the change that we'd all benefit from.
Thank you, Sarah. Nikki, would love to hear your thoughts. Why do you do the work that you do, and what is at stake?
Yeah, thank you. I do the work, why I do what I do. It's very personal, as I'm sure it is for others. I'm Native and I'm also a mother, and I carry these identities into the work that I do every day. From the moment I knew I was going to be a mom, I was committed to ensuring a strong future for my daughter before her feet even touched the earth. And so we run initiatives and programs at the Center for Native American Youth that I hope my daughter would want to take ownership with and run with someday. We can't afford to leave Native youth out of our narratives and these policies that we're shaping. And we're really seeing it true, as my colleague had just mentioned, the importance in giving young people agency, allowing them to take ownership of seeing the change that they desire to see. I want to make sure that we're allowing opportunity for young people to share their truth in their own words. We're seeing young people, especially in the Center for Native American Youth, are looking to lead beyond November. Youth are at an inflection point where they are truly shaping and changing systemic oppression that tribal communities have seen since the onset of European colonization. And so if we can get young people to truly lead and shape communities, to engage civically year-round, how amazing, and how I get so inspired when I think about the way that we can truly transform Indigenous communities.
I really appreciate how you mentioned the way that identity really frames that work, the work that you do and the why of what you're doing. And, one of the themes that stood out in the video is, how one of the young people talked about how we really need to kind of celebrate differences, and some of those differences might connect to the various identities that we hold. And, we have such a polarized era that we are living in right now. And, this next question is to explore whether the work of engaging young people in civic action, can it be nonpartisan or must it be partisan? And especially as you pay attention to some of those identities, and what are those areas in which we must preserve space for healthy debate and difference of opinion? And we'll start with David here.
Yeah, no, I think it has to be nonpartisan. Young people need to be engaged in studying the issues of the day. So whether those are issues around housing, healthcare, gun rights, and how do you balance gun rights with gun violence that's been taking place in communities all across America. Truly educating young people is not partisan. It means truly exploring all sides of the issue. There are those in this country who are liberal and progressive who feel that their way is the only way. And there are people in this country who are completely right-wing conservatives who believe that their way is the only way. And it's part of the reason why our country is in the situation that we're in today. There's no one philosophy, ideology that is absolutely right. It's a blend and a balance, and seeing people's point of view and being able to be critical thinkers about all issues and respecting someone else's right to maintain their own position based upon what they believe. But as educators, what we should be doing is making sure that we are presenting all the issues, allowing our young people to study these issues, and then to be able to have healthy, respectful debate about the issues. You know, one of the challenges that we're seeing even in this moment as we're talking about civic engagement is we're seeing the NFL players and the NBA players and everybody saying, you know, go out and vote. And we all need to go out and vote. But just as important as voting is, knowing what you are voting for is critical. You should not just vote for somebody who's in a particular party. You should vote because you know where they stand on the issues that are important to you. So not only do we have so many of our citizens who don't vote, they have no clear, deep understanding around these issues that are being debated every single day. Our school system is where we should be providing a healthy, safe forum for all of our young people to debate those issues. And if you don't do it in our schools, where else will it happen? We're getting ready to have a presidential election. There are lots of issues around the Supreme Court, the healthcare system, so many other things. Imagine if all of our students in our school were well-versed in all of these issues themselves. Just think about how the profound impact that would have when young people graduate from high school and actually step out into the world, that they have a really deep understanding about all of these issues. You'd have a very different type of citizenry. But for far too many of us, our young people are just going to school. They're not being truly educated. They're just doing the routine of school every single day. But when you ask them about critical issues that are happening, they don't even have a clue because they've not been exposed to it. And that's unfortunate. And we can change that.
Thank you, David. Sarah, what are your thoughts? Is this nonpartisan? Should it be partisan? And how do we create a space for healthy debate and difference of opinion?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really hard question because what has become partisan is like such a much larger umbrella of topics than should even be. Like, why is it considered partisan that we want to make voting easily accessible for all who are able to? Why is that partisan? And I think this is where it's really important for leaders in the education field to push back against against these questions. It shouldn't be partisan that we want to make sure that everybody should be able to vote. It shouldn't be partisan that voting should be considered accessible. It shouldn't be a partisan fight. I think about our folks in Texas that we work with. Our group in Texas had to sue the state of Texas to try to make vote by mail accessible for people under the age of 65 in the middle of a pandemic. We lost. And so people have to vote in person in Texas. That is, for some reason, a partisan thought that voting safely is something that we have to, like, why do we have to fight for that? And so I really feel for our educators here because young people know these issues so well because they experience them. They see what happens when their parents are losing their jobs. They understand what happens when, they're worried about families being disrupted and separated in their communities. Young people experience all of this, and it's up to our school systems to be able to facilitate that dialogue about how these issues impact their lives and how engaging in our democratic process is one way to address these problems. I think the thing that gives me a lot of hope as someone who runs a nonpartisan network is young people don't give a damn about political parties. More young people are registering as independents than Democrats or Republicans at this point. I think that's actually really good for our democracy. But I think one of the things that we all have to wrestle with together is questioning what is or is not partisan. people's dignity and humanity should not be considered a partisan topic. How I show up in the world as a Latina should not be considered a partisan topic. That families that come from countries like where my family came from are being separated at the border should be universally horrific. And so that's where I really hope that especially our educators are able to help lead these tough conversations to say, like, yeah, we should have and wrestle with a lot of ideas, but dignity and humanity should not be thrown aside for most impacted communities along the way when we're actually talking about people's lives. And so this is where I really feel for educators. I used to teach as well. I taught in a very conservative school district that didn't want to acknowledge my LGBTQ students and who were in a really tough place. And so this is where I just extra appreciate the conversation in this space, because we have to figure this out together. We have to universally say together, dignity and humanity and the treatment of one another should not be considered a partisan topic. How we work to address the many problems that our country is facing, yeah, let's do that. Let's wrestle together and wrestle ideas, but we cannot harm people along the way in that debate and discussion.
Thanks, Sonia. So we wanted to just shift gears a little bit here. We have, and you have, this audience of funders, the philanthropic community in education, and we wanted to dive into a little bit what you would recommend and like to see from the philanthropic community. And we thought a good starting point for that, it's so each of the work that you're doing and engaged in, you are meeting kids where they are to really support them in developing and changing the system. Can you maybe share one story about how important philanthropy is to the work that you're doing? Maybe, Sarah, we can pick up and start with you.
So, like I said, I'm really lucky to run a network of youth-led and focused organizations leading electoral engagement work when it's election time, including in the local elections we will face next year. And actually, the more local we go, the more you can feel the impact and the change, right? And it's really inspiring to engage young people to vote in school board races. So just to say that out loud. But one of the things that philanthropy can do, so doing this work, we're in a presidential bump right now. The groups in our network, their C3 budgets at this point are probably 60% higher than they were last year, possibly more so than that. Some are doubled, some are tripled. And that swing is really harmful, because what it means is in times like this, we're able to hire more young people to do this work, to engage their peers in this process. But after the election, all of that contracts. And so we get in this horrible swing of voting feeling transactional, because we're funding transactional work, because we're saying, yep, big presidential election, we want young people to vote. Now we're going to care about young people. Let's give them the resources they need to be able to do this work. Then after the election, when we get the results we do or do not want, let's back away. And so next year is going to be a really scary year for a lot of youth-led organizations, youth-focused organizations who are trying to do this work. Resources are good now. Come April, May next year, it's going to be really scary. And so this is why it's so important for our big philanthropic institutions. Y'all know what your budgets are going to be next year. We need commitments coming in early next year to help stabilize this work, to help stabilize the transactional funding that will come, that is certainly not inspiring and in many ways can be harmful to the work. But we need folks to come in and support these groups for the long run, because the ones who are able to stick around to disrupt the transactional nature of voting and our democratic process as is, we need young people to have the resources to be able to help govern, to help set the agenda when elected officials are sworn in and should be doing their jobs, to make sure they're reflecting the demands of young people, and young people are brought into the process. So again, it's not just this, hey, vote, peace out. It's great, you voted. What do you care about? You care about that your tuition is so high at your community college? Well, come on, let's figure out a way to make community college free. You care about policing in your community, and we want to defund the police? Cool, let's get together and reimagine what policing looks like in our city council meetings, right? That's the more important work in many ways, is what happens post-election. And this is where I think y'all have a massive role in helping to make sure that we can keep young people doing this work, that we can keep them in for the long run, that we can keep them engaged and motivating their peers to be part of, again, this democratic process that is bigger than voting. And so that's what I'd say is, we need your resources. We need them early next year, because heaven forbid, as someone who's been doing youth organizing for too long, so much so that I now get to tell stories and fundraise, we lose a lot of groups, and and it's very possible that we lose groups next year. And that is the scary part of the work. Is that knowing that the futures of a lot of really powerful work that's happening right now is not as sure, as not as clear. So that's where I think y'all can have a massive role here.
Thank you, Sarah. So really looking to sustain the work to really support the kind of transformation you're talking about. David, what about you? Why is philanthropy so important to sustaining and thriving work that you're doing?
It's important, it's critical because the school to prison pipeline is real. It's not an amorphous thing. I've chosen to engage myself in this work around what's happening with Black and brown boys, because Black and brown boys show up at the bottom of all the indicators of success. When you look at the public narrative that plays out in the media every day, it's overwhelmingly Black men, Black boys, brown men and brown boys who seem to suffer the most, seem to be the most under attack. And we've made a decision to try to lean into that space to give these young men a space of hope. To tell you a very quick story, I had a woman, Miss Williams, who showed up at my door when I was the principal of the Eagle Academy and said, I have got 3 boys here and I need you to take them into your school because I don't know if they're going to make it. She said, I'm not their birth mother, I'm their foster care mother. They've never met their father and their mother died of drugs. 2 of them are a set of twins, and one brother is a year older, but he's in the same grade because he had been left behind. They were the very embodiment of young men who, without the proper intervention and supports, would not make it. And we brought them into the Eagle Academy, and we gave them all the things that they needed. But the things that we were able to give to them, we were able to provide because of the additional philanthropic support that we've gotten, that allowed us to have a great extended day program in our school, that allowed us to be able to create opportunities for partnership where these young men were able to get internships and see the possibilities for themselves. And they came into my school in the 9th grade, and 2 of the brothers graduated, the set of twins. One graduated and went off and joined the Army and is now married and has a family and is doing quite well for himself, and we're really proud. His twin brother graduated from Morehouse College with an engineering degree and is now an engineer and is doing really well because of the supports that they had received. And the oldest brother, who had gotten left back and when he came to us was in the same grade as his twin brothers, was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter and is serving life in prison somewhere in Georgia. Ran in with the wrong crowd and got himself completely caught up. And in fact, what happened in his life was the reason why we shifted our model to start earlier. We start now at the 6th grade, because had we gotten to him earlier, we think we would have had a much better chance of helping him to be as successful as his brothers were as well. So what is my call to action for the philanthropic community? I would call their attention to the report that Echoing Green put out recently, which is to support Black-led organizations. The philanthropic dollars that are going out, we don't get nearly enough, and the ones that do go out, very rarely do they go out to organizations which are led by people of color. The unrestricted net assets of Black-led organizations are 76% smaller than their white-led counterparts. That's real. So what do we need? We need quick and unencumbered investment. We need philanthropy to give bigger. We're in a crisis. Remove some of these unfunded measures of accountability. Shift the paradigm on evaluation, taking into account and valuing non-traditional success measures. We've been in this space. We know what it takes. And we know how to transform the lives of so many of our young men. What's at stake? Citibank recently put out a report that said race-based discrimination and inequality has cost the United States about $16 trillion in lost GDP over the last 2 decades. So if you don't get the argument from a moral standpoint of how you help everybody to achieve the American dream and help everyone to realize their full potential, well, then look at the economic argument. When you keep this population so marginalized and on the sidelines, and yet you're watching the continuing increase of Black and brown people in America, and you keep them marginalized, they cannot help this country to compete and to be all that it's supposed to be. And so that would be my argument. When you invest in groups like Eagle and like so many others who are in this space trying to do this work, you're ultimately investing in the success of our nation to ultimately be all that it is supposed to be.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate those comments. Nikki, how about you? Can you weigh in on how philanthropy is so critical to your work?
Absolutely. Just with recognizing the importance of storytelling, I'd like to tell the story about a youth organizer from our networks for the Center for Native American Youth. Her name is Shyvana Underwood. She's a youth from the Quinault Indian Nation, which is located in present-day Western Washington, right along the coast to the Pacific Ocean. And we worked with Philanthropy to support our Democracy as Indigenous campaign that I talked about earlier through culturally competent curriculum training, support, technical assistance, intergenerational learning space, and peer-to-peer learning space, all deeply rooted in traditional values and civic engagement. Shyvana worked on a campaign to ensure her community was accurately counted with the upcoming census. As you know, the data is collected to determine funding for education, social services, and other programming. An undercount will represent and result minimal funding for services, including improvements on, Indian reservation infrastructure, such as roads or housing on the reservations, healthcare funding, such as Indian Health Services, and the impacts of political representation in tribal communities. In 1990, in fact, the census, Native Americans were undercounted by more than 12%. And in 2010, they were uncounted by almost 5%, more than double the undercount of any other ethnic group Indian country was. The undercount tells us the amount of distrust that Native people have and the opportunity for young people to lead in changing this narrative through this Democracy as Indigenous campaign. So Shyvana worked within her community on initiatives that normalize conversations about counting, whether it was bringing Indigenous foods to elders and talking to them about what it means to belong and to count culturally, or making sure that her peers and young people in the community are holding their parents and caregivers accountable, making sure they fill out their census forms, and what it means traditionally as a Quinault people to belong. So because of Shyvana's youth-led efforts, for the first time in history, the Quinault Indian Nation has been counted entirely. Just last week, Shyvana shared with me a letter sent to her from the United States Census Bureau congratulating her and the Quinault Indian Nation on her youth-led efforts for 100% completion of the census. This work could not be done without philanthropic support. With that, I want to make very clear that our landscape right now, we know Indian country only receives, I think it's under 1% of philanthropic dollar to support Native-led organizations. We need to work together to increase this if we truly are committed to racial equity in the philanthropic space. Invest in Indian country, invest in Native youth. If you're in a conversation about philanthropic investment and you don't see Native or Indigenous representation there, step back and ask yourself why not. Include Native people, include Native youth, and allow us agency to truly take the wheel of this car that we're trying to drive together on racial equity.
Thank you, Nikki. And it's so great to get really these great ideas for all of us, so we can work on this together. Let's see, Andrew, we haven't heard from you yet on this topic. Can you speak a little bit about what philanthropy means to your work?
Thank you for the question. I think a part of what philanthropy can do is to support and invest in both the supply and the demand side of student voice in our democracy. The supply side is obviously critical. That's getting more civics into schools, further support for teachers who are doing amazing work. Funders are doing a lot in this area, and rightly so. We've seen our students, as I'm sure many other of my colleagues on this panel have seen, be directly impacted and transformed through that. But the demand side of student voice and democracy is using policy as a lever to incentivize and devote greater attention to democracy education. And so Generation Citizen and many of our students, like the ones that you all saw on the video before we began this panel, have helped us to advocate at the state level for civics legislation in places as varied as Massachusetts and Utah to make sure that folks have access to hands-on civics education that is not how a bill becomes a law or separation of powers, but instead helps them to roll up their sleeves and get directly involved in the public policy process. And so when funders support that work on the demand side, it helps to not only expand access to civics education, but it has this virtuous cycle of creating a more effective and conducive climate for civic learning to be provided to students. And so continue to support that supply side, but also using that demand side of policy as a lever to have a positive multiplier effect on the work can help make civics, instead of being what's sometimes perceived as a rote, boring subject, the most consequential and invigorating subject that students get in the classroom that has positive long-term effects for democratic participation.
That is great, Andrew. I love that, turning civics from something that might be considered not as exciting to perhaps the most exciting. And on that note, so thank you, all of you. You know, I'm reminded of I think it was Kobe, his song at the end of the video, where he said, "Can't let this future go." And all of you are just so key to helping him realize and helping all of our youth realize that vision. So we're 3 weeks out almost to a presidential election. And as Sarah mentioned, the work will continue much further after that. Maybe just ask each of you to weigh in on your call to action for funders, because I do think, speaking for many of us, that we see this work in partnership with you. We are interested and dedicated to this journey with you. What is your call to action to the philanthropic community? And David, I think you mentioned yours, but it was a very powerful one. So would you like to add to it? And then we can move to the rest of our speakers too.
I would just, my final point on that would just purely be to say that the role of philanthropy is critical, but if it wants to have the greatest impact, philanthropy needs to bring together partners, school systems collectively. Schools systems are designed to work in silos, as is most of the work that our various organizations are doing. There's very rarely do we find opportunities to work together. Funders have the built-in mechanism for incentive to allow and to encourage people to work together, because I think that's where you get the greatest impact. We've done work in New York City with Generation Citizen. It's one of the best programs I've seen, and yet they struggle to get the entire New York City school system on board. So it's too much of the work is piecemeal. But the funders have the leverage to get the greater school district together with these community-based organizations that are doing phenomenal work to make sure that we're maximizing the work. So that would be something that I would certainly encourage.
That's great, David. Sarah.
Yeah, so I said a little bit of this before, but number one, if you can move resources in Q1 of next year, please do so. 2017 was really tough for a lot of our organizations. I'll say I became an ED in 2017. A lot of our funders who were amazing in support were amazing about 3 to 4 months later than they typically were. And that was really hard for the organization, especially coming in as a new executive director. And so no matter what happens post-election, the work will continue. And we really need your support to make sure that the work is able to continue post-election. 2, I note that transitions will happen after presidential cycles. EDs move to different roles. It's really common. We expect a lot of transition within our own network. And what I'd say is, especially as there's this call, a much overdue call for more people of color to serve as executive directors of organizations, we really need foundations to double down support. EDs of color are brought in because of the experiences that we have, because of the big, bold ideas that we have. And it's not a good use of our time and energy to be spending 70% of our time fundraising to keep our doors open and our staff paid. So when we see transition happening, when you talk about wanting to embrace new executive directors, specifically of color, double down early to make sure that they're able to bring that creativity that we so look for in leading our organizations. And then number 3, to be hella specific to the 3 weeks, we're going to see a lot of really crappy narrative coming out about the youth vote. We always do around this time. And the thing to remember is that young people do tend to vote late. That is kind of the norm. Young people have voted in large numbers thus far. We've seen big increases in youth turnout since the 2016 election. 2018 was bananas. It was like a 10% increase in turnout across the country, and even greater when you go down to the state level in some communities. But we need your help in disrupting that narrative because saying young people won't vote only makes young people not vote. So we need to make sure that we're pushing candidate campaigns to engage young people directly, to fight for their votes, to earn their votes. And then when you see those stories, that narrative start to come up questioning young people's power, you have to disrupt it. Don't believe it. I think every single panelist here has plenty of stories and data to show why that is all wrong. And so please join us in disrupting that crappy narrative that we know is coming. We've already started to see it bubble a bit, and know that young people are fighting to turn out their peers for a better country for all of us.
Thank you, Sarah. Andrew, any final words on this?
I'd issue a twofold call to action. I think the first is to take advantage of the most interactive, consequential civics lesson happening all around us, and that's calling for the integrity of this election, regardless of voter preference, regardless of party affiliation. When you have undercounting of voters, whether that's through purging the rolls, as has happened in my home state of Georgia, whether that's disproportionate allocation of polling sites to population, it indicates to students that the democracy that we talk about is not fully serious about administering free, fair, and competitive elections. And so really leaning into this civics lesson that we have happening all around us by calling for the integrity of this election is not a partisan concern, but I'd actually say it's a process-based concern about making sure democracy is as good as it's promised. And then the second call that I'd share is for funders to really leverage their capacity to catalyze change by collecting the near-term importance of this election, which certainly has far-reaching consequences, to the less obvious long-term importance of stewarding our democracy. And through supporting EDs of color, as Sarah has mentioned, youth organizing, civics education, all of the work that my fellow panelists are talking about, that helps us to make sure that the important exigencies of this moment are connected to the more long-term stewardship and strengthening of our republic.
Thank you, Andrew. And Nikki, we'll close with you on this.
Yeah, thank you. I had kind of given some statistics already about the philanthropic dollar and the need to better invest in Indian country. And just like my colleagues had said, Sarah in particular, just the importance in investing in narrative change. We know our young people are fierce and that they have the power to shape and create a future that is reflective of their priorities, whether it's through voting, civic engagement, or different processes. And so we just need more dollars and more support from philanthropy to invest in those changes. We need to take a step back and let young people truly lead and guide us in this desire that we're trying to see. And so my call to action is simple. You know, whether it's 3 weeks away from this historic election or light years away, we need to be giving more agency to young people and supporting those agencies that are committed to uplifting and empowering the youth voice.
Thank you, Nikki. And thank you to all of you. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And Sonia, thank you too for co-facilitating this with us. And I think we're going to turn it over to Celine, or back to Celine.
Hello. Well, thank you all on our panel. That was fantastic. And thank you all in the audience for living with us through a little bit of technical glitching en route to a really great conversation. I want to leave you now with a reminder to join us back at 3:30, join our interim activities, join us tomorrow, and also participate in our creative sprint. As we go to break, we're going to share a video about how to participate in the creative sprint. Thank you all and see you later.